Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You're a little quiet. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Oh, all right. I did promise to play the piano. I'm going to in a little bit, but first I want us to notice something because it has to do with what we were talking about the last hour, talking about a sermon that always moves from an itch to a scratch, or in terms of the diagram that we looked at in the first hour, it starts with an oops. Now, I know some of you did because I saw people turning around. Did you notice how difficult it was for your chaplain to get order in the place this afternoon? Did you notice that the conversations kept going while he was beginning to speak? Nobody's admitting it, but I could hear it up here, and he kept going, and finally I saw one person turn around and try to shush people from talking, and there's a good, legitimate, and honorable reason for that. And that is, when you came in here, knowing other people, seeing other people, engaging other people in conversation, there were quite a number of oops going on. And you just wouldn't let them go because they hadn't moved from an itch to a scratch. And as long as you haven't scratched them yet, you're going to keep talking. And that's pretty basic to the issue of communication. When we get together with people, we don't pull out a 3x5 card with 3 points. When we gather and see someone we know, we say, well, did they ever get that house built? How is your husband? Is he doing better? You always begin a conversation with something that is sideways, something that is incomplete. That is where you pay a call on Widow Jones in your parish, and you don't get by to see Widow Jones as often as you'd like. Well, that's a lie. You don't get by to see Widow Jones as often as you should. So you go by to pay a call on Widow Jones. Well, she is no more happy to see you than you to call, but she's gracious too. Truth is not always the best standard, the highest standard, Civility is perhaps higher at times. And so she greets you, invites you in, and you say, well, it's good to see you, Mrs. Jones. And she says, good to see you too. And then you say, how are you doing? To which she says, fine. Well, that's kind of a disappointment. What are you going to talk about? Well, so you start again, and how's the family? Terrific. She says, oh, something special? You inquire? And she said, oh, no, I just mean they're just doing fine. You see your problem? Do you sense your problem? If one of them would have had malaria, there would be something to talk about. See, the conversation, every time you tried to open up an oops or an itch, she set it down with a scratch. And therefore, nothing could have continuity. Well, that's what was going on at the beginning of this session when you had a lot of itches to deal with before we could come back to order. Now, in going to the piano to play a number, I do also want to suggest that there's something that I want you to notice, and that is jazz improvisation is very much like the model of preaching. I didn't know it. I'd written 2 books before I knew there was a connection between the two. I finally had to sort of have it discovered for me. At any rate, what you notice in a jazz tune, often, not always, but in a jazz tune, such as the hymn I'm about to play, it's a very simple tune. But pretty soon, and I can't do it as much as a group of 5 or 6 people could do it, but pretty soon things begin to get complicated. The chordal structure, the harmonics underneath begin to shift to some degree. Pretty soon, you lose the melody line altogether. Pretty soon, if it's a small group you're listening to, you ask the question, do they remember what song they're playing? And in fact, I've been in groups when we had, in fact, forgotten what song we were playing. Because often some of those simpler songs are built on 1s and 4s and 5s. You musicians know what I mean by the choral structure of 1s and 4s and 5s. And there's so many songs based on that you could be playing any of 1,000 tunes. So anyway, what happens is you get a thing, you take something simple, and then you turn it sideways, and pretty soon sideways in another way, and pretty soon you may feel even absolutely lost until finally, if you're in a group that's forgotten, somebody remembers what you're playing, and you turn around and head home. It's the heading home that's the issue. And when you play the last time through, it's very similar to the first time you played it. But it's different because of where you've been. That's the way I think a narrative-type sermon works. Well, I'm going to play something. I'm going to play, it reminds me of an interview in Karl Barth's later days. Some news reporter was trying to interview and say, now you've written just dozens and dozens of books, you've written everything. Could you summarize the heart of those books for my readership? And he said, oh yes, of course I can. It's I will summarize all those into a central thing. Jesus loves me. This I know. For the Bible tells me so. There's something else that we need to recognize about what I'm talking about in terms of preaching, what music does, not just jazz improvisation, but other classical music that starts and develops different themes, modalities, and finally comes back home. And that is, notice how a hymn has built in both in the music itself and also in the lyrics often a fundamental turnaround. Remember at the bottom of the loop there was an aha, there was a turnaround that happens toward the end. Well, it also happens in hymns, for example. For example, and I'm going back, but I'm not going to play a song. I'll just demonstrate something, and that is, if what? I didn't hear that.
Play for Jesus.
Oh, yeah. For example, if you take What a Friend We Have in Jesus. We're going to repeat that, right? In other words, you did that twice, essentially. It's called AA. Now we're going to go to B. Changes keys. Goes to the fifth. Now what's it going to do? It's going to go back to A. Back to... In short, that middle part, the bridge as it's called, the bridge sets it into a different modality and then turns around and brings it back home. But you should also notice that the lyrics do the same thing. In a 4-stanza hymn, always look at the third stanza. But we often don't look at all. If some leader of worship decides that we don't have time for 4 stanzas, what 3 are we going to do? 1, 2, and 4. What do we leave out? 3. Well, guess where the turnaround is? 3. In other words, the first says it, the second duplicates it in a slightly different version. The third one is like the bridge, sets us off on a different path, and then it comes back and repeats the refrain of 1. But if you take the third out, you take the guts out, because that's the decisive turnaround. Well, anyway, back to our subject at hand. Because that's what goes on in preaching as I imagine it. I see. Did I? Yeah, it's on. I guess we'll. Okay, where we were when we left off. It was an understanding, essentially, that the way a sermon moves is an itch to a scratch. And in the first book, the homiletical plot, specifically, we talked about it starting with an oops. Is it on yet? Yeah, it's about to be on. There we are. We've got. Should I have hit some other? We're missing the first 2. Who knows how to get rid of the little square box?
It's on the projector. The menu thing is showing on the projector.
It's. Oh, there we are. Thank you. Anyway, now, we talked about the turnaround. The turnaround is essentially the aha that I listed with regard to music. Now, that's a perfectly adequate view of how the plot sounds in terms of a biblical sermon. And in fact, you could take one of the most famous of Jesus' parables and see how it works. For example, if we're dealing with the parable of the sons, then the younger son said, "Father, now where are we in the loop? We're at the oops, right? What the oops says is, Father, we know that you're going to croak someday. Could we just imagine that it's right now? Because, I have a life to live and money to spend, and I'd just like to get on with it if you don't mind. Now, we're going to miss you dearly when you go. But let's just pretend it's already happened, and because I have a life to live." That's the oops. And then you notice Jesus, one of the problems with the oops is people often jump over to we or yeah too quickly. It would be very easy to have Jesus tell the parable and say, "So he went to the far country and was absolutely disgusted by what he found and said, I thought I didn't want to be home, but maybe home is better than I thought, and therefore turned back around and went back home." And the father said, "Hey, it's only been 3 days." Now, that's not the way Jesus told it, is it? Where's the dean? Is the dean, what was you heard somebody say that somebody, first make them laugh. Yes. Do you hear that? Make them laugh, make them cry, but whatever you do, make them wait. precisely the point of Jesus, the modality of Jesus. He doesn't have him come home in 3 days. He gets there and he has a grand time. I mean, he's got several grand with which to have a grand time. And he just, friends of both sexes, and just living it up, until pretty soon he runs out of cash. When he runs out of cash, he runs out of friends. And by the way, that's not enough for the complication. We're into the what now? We're into the ugh. Things are getting really ugly. We're not asking analysis of why. We're just letting the story continue to roll. So what happens also besides the fact that he runs out of money? What? You're ahead of me. What? Famine. Then the pig. Yes. There's a famine. Jesus builds up the complication. Things get worse. There's a famine in the land. And so not only does he run out of friends, he runs out of the capacity to do ordinary work. So then he gets up to a pig pen and gets a swine's eye view of life. Now, things are really tough here. In fact, it says he'd like to eat the junk that the pigs are eating, let alone the pigs. You remember this is a Jewish boy. You remember how fond the Jews are of pork. He's feeding the pig, would like to eat what they eat. Nobody gives him anything. And then what happens to him? He comes to himself, is the way it's put. Before he comes to himself and he heads home and he memorizes a speech of confession. If you memorize those little speeches, that you can become a preacher someday. That's how we got there, some of us. At any rate, but the point is, I was so happy with the way Helmut Thielicke, the great German preacher, put it. He said, when he came to himself, he said, it wasn't that the prodigal got so sick of the pig pen that he turned home. It was his understanding of home that turned him so sick of the pig pen. Do you hear it? Oh, yes. It was his understanding of home that made him so sick of the pig pen. That's good Wesleyan theology. You might use a little Wesleyan theology from a time to time. The doctrine of prevenient grace, because the Father was still loving the Son. And so that's the turnaround, the aha. He comes to himself. It's the gift of the Father's love that allows it to be possible for him to come to himself, and hence to have the courage to head home. And so he heads home, and he's memorizing the speech. Does he get to finish the speech? What happens instead? The Father interrupts him, right? And says, quick, bring the robe. Bring the robe. Oh, Dad, not the robe of honor. I've spent it. I said, bring the robe of honor and bring the ring. Oh, Dad, not the ring of authority. I done spent it. I said, bring the ring. And the sandals of sonship. That's how you could tell the difference between a servant and a son. The son wore sandals. Bring the sandals while you're at it. Because this son of mine was dead. Now he's alive. He was lost. Now he's found. It is party time. And they had themselves a blast. Everybody had a great time, right? Well, no. Because you see, there's more than one way to get lost. You might go to the far country and waste your substance in riotous living. You may just stay home and just get righteous. Well, at any rate, yeah. Oh, yeah. That parable will preach. Yeah, well, yes. At any rate, so do you see how it followed? The we was the Father's embrace in the party. But as Fred Kradic one time said, do you really like parties for prodigals? And the is now, he is now a son once more. The truth of the matter, Jesus' parable actually starts the next loop going and gets just about to ugh. When the elder son says, big deal, Pop, am I ever impressed? When did you ever throw a party for me? The party I get's called work. We still don't know whether he ever came to the party. So in a sense, you got this loop, and then you got it really at the start of the next. Well, at any rate, the point is that this works in a lot of ways. But I discovered several things in the period of 20 years. I haven't repented of the loop, but I have tried to refine it. and make it more elastic, less constraining. And what I did essentially was, you notice along the line there's only 4 instead of 5. The one that was the experience of the good news, is now across the bottom. And there's a good reason for that. At least I think it's a good reason. And that is what I discovered. It is not always the case, as it is in the prodigal son story, it is not always the case that you have the decisive turn, then the good news. That's what happened to the prodigal son. He turned, thanks to prevenient grace. He was able to turn, and then they had the party, which is then the manifest love of a father whose love will never let the son go. But sometimes the good news happens at a different place. For example, supposing the story is the Good Samaritan. And that is, you remember he got mugged as he's in the ditch. You remember the lawyer had said, what does it take? He said, well, I've been to confirmation class twice, baptized all over the place. And he said, well, do all this and you shall live. He said, well, who's my neighbor? After the love of the Lord thy God and the neighbors. Who's a perfectly good Jewish question. That is, who has a right to my time and energy, my life? And you hear the question? Who is just the good Jews or all the Jews? Good Jews and Good Samaritans? Methodists and Seventh-day Adventists? Who are you including here? You say, who is my neighbor? And instead of giving a 3-point sermon, Jesus tells a story. And it's the story of the Good Samaritan. Well, you notice the priest and the Levite went on by. Somebody put it one way. He said the priest and Levite, seeing he already had been robbed, went by on the other side. I don't know about that, but anyway, but then the hated Samaritan came up. Now you do understand that one of the rabbinic sayings known in the days of Jesus was that any Jew who receives help, assistance, aid in any way from a Samaritan will delay the coming of the Messiah, will delay the coming of the kingdom. So let me tell you, if he's a good Jew in the ditch, he's going to pretend to be dead when the Samaritan comes up, because he does not want a Samaritan to aid him and delay the coming of the reign of God. That's just a little piece underneath. Anyway, so the Samaritan comes, takes him to the inn. You know the story. Well, that's the good news. That's what we had is the The good news is somebody tended to his needs and continued to left plastic so the innkeeper could just keep putting the MasterCard in the thing as he. Well, at any rate, then Jesus turns to the lawyer, and Jesus turns to the lawyer and says, "Who proved neighbor to the one in need?" Wow. It was a long time before I realized what that means. Do you sense that the word neighbor just changed? When the lawyer asked the question, who is my neighbor? Neighbor means helpee, right? Who is my neighbor? Who's the one to receive my life's energy and care? When Jesus gets through with the parable, is it who proved neighbor? Oh, whoops, we got a reversal here. Instead of neighbor, meaning the one receiving the help, it's the one giving the help. Which is my way of thinking, imaginably. It's quite possible Jesus is thinking about the lawyer with whom he's visiting. And who's thinking, who do I have to help anyway? Who do I have to be attentive to as a neighbor? And I think it just may be that Jesus is wondering, maybe the guy doesn't know who's in the ditch. He's in the ditch. His arrogance has put him in the ditch. Is there anybody who can help this righteous one who's in the ditch? Only an outcast. Only an outcast. The Samaritan. Did you hear? Well, see, that's the reversal. Who proved neighbor? That's the reversal. So in that case, you see, the sudden shift happened after the good news. So in that case, you see that left arrow coming up? That's what happened here. Well, sometimes 3 and 4, as we had it in the last one, happens at the same time. Sometimes it is the good news that makes the shift. For example, the Matthew version of the parable of the talents. You remember it, don't you? One had 5, one had 2. You remember, a talent is the equivalent of 15 years of labor for the average male in the days of Jesus. 15 years. Think of it. It's no little pocket change here. So, one was given 5. One was given 2. One was given 1. The 5 made 5 more, right? And turned back in 8. Right? Just wanted to see if you're here. Turned in 8. How much did he turn back? 10. You know, this is an un-American story. There's no profit here. There's no profit anywhere here. He didn't have anything. Zip. He had zip. He was given 5, made 5 more, turned in 10. Now what's he got? Zip. One was given 2. He had zip. Was given 2. Made 2 more, turned in 3. No, turned in 4. What's he get? Zip. Well, he turned in 4, I'm beginning to feel sorry for those 2 instead of the third one. You know, he says, enter into the joy of your master. Well, the master's the only one getting any. I mean, what do you get if you say, you've been faithful over a little, I will set you over much? In short, what do you get if you've been faithful to the Lord? More work. That's what you get. Hey, if you like work, you're at the right place. You know, in my judicatory, district superintendent says, I'm asking you to be the head of the committee on impossible ministries. And you say, that's impossible. That's why we ask you. Everybody says you're exactly the right one, which means nobody else will do it. Well, you take the job. You do better than you think. You think you're surprised. You talk to the DS. Any rate, so frankly, you take an impossible task and you make it work. What's going to happen to you? In a few, yeah. Hey, you did so well with 5. Here, try 11. That's what happened in the story, right? But where's the grace in the story? I'm looking for the grace here. Isn't there any we that was, number 4 along the line in the last one? Oh, I didn't understand until the new RSV Bible came out. You got to watch it whenever it says servant, because they may mean slave. Servant is kind of a mixed term, but slave isn't. When you think about servants and slaves, slaves and masters, it's kind of an unequal thing, isn't it? Who's got the power in the system of slavery? The master. Who's got the vulnerability? The slave. All in one, all in none. Until Jesus came along with this story. And so remember, he didn't summon his 3 favorite slaves. He summoned his slaves. He had 3. He summoned 3. He delivered to them everything he had. And he goes off to the far country. While he's gone, who's got the power? What did you say? The slaves have the power. And who's got the vulnerability? The master. Because guess who's nervous when he comes back? He's nervous more than anybody else, because if they've squandered what he gave him, he doesn't have a future. He's done. He can't even afford slaves. So talk about shaking, and so the whole point of this story is to say that he leaves. They've got the power. He's got the vulnerability. He comes back when he says, enter into the joy of your master. Do you hear what it means? It means, I, who relinquish my power in order that you might have power. Now you've tasted power. You know the joy of the master. Enter into the joy. I hear another text wafting across the territory. Jesus, who did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself and became what? Became a slave, in order that we, in other words, became one of us in order that we might become like him. Now, when you think about that story, notice that the decisive reversal happens precisely when the good news happens. So you don't have, does this go backwards? Yeah. So you don't have the decisive turn, which means the reversal of, and then you have the good news we and aha are one and the same. So you got 1, 2, 3, 4. Blind Bartimaeus, in blind Bartimaeus you got something else. In blind Bartimaeus, remember, he said, Son of David, have mercy. And you remember what the crowd said? What did the crowd say? Be quiet. Yeah, you said it too kindly. Yeah, shut up. Shut your mouth. And Jesus, it's so beautiful a moment. They're yelling for. He does the only thing that's responsible. He yells louder than he did before. And Jesus stood still. Yes, sir. Oh, thank you. Where was I? Let's see. Huh? Oh, blind Bartimaeus. Yes. Sorry. Everybody was talking at once. I didn't quite get it. Yes, blind. And so, do you know? So he yells even louder. And it says, Jesus stood still. Don't you kind of see Jesus? Almost halfway in the middle of a step. In other words, the one who had been ignored by his townspeople for all this time gets Jesus' attention immediately, all of his attention. You remember, this is a guy who doesn't have a name. His father has a name. His father's name is Timaeus. What's his name? Son of somebody. Son of somebody. He's marginalized. Gets Jesus' entire attention. Now, Jesus said, your faith has made you well. Well, that's a half-truth. That is, he called him son of David. He still couldn't see. By the way, did you notice the humor? Jesus has them lead him to him. Isn't that one? The very ones, no doubt, who said, shut your mouth. Now get to take him by the hand and lead him to Jesus. I like it. Anyway, I told you sometimes these lectures get into preaching. Anyway, but the point is, he gets healed first, and then Jesus says, go your way. Does he go his way? What does he do? He goes Jesus' way. He doesn't go his way. He didn't go back to the corner with his cup with a pencil selling. He follows Jesus to Jerusalem. That's do you sense in that case the we of being healed happened first. And then the reversals, he didn't go his way, he went Jesus' way. And of course there's a bad side to it, he can see now for the first time that the trouble with now that he can see, he's got to see. That's what always comes with sight, If you ever get your sight again, you're going to have to look. That's the way it works. Anyway, well, enough of that. But the point is there, the four happened before the three. And that's why I finally got to this to say, you can't tell whether the good news will happen just before the reversal or at it or just after it. And we need the loop to be flexible enough to entertain all those possibilities. So at any rate, also I changed the term. The aha in the last one I called the reversal. I now call it a sudden shift because sometimes it is a direct reversal. Sometimes it isn't 180 degrees. Sometimes it's 146. But it's always radical. For example, the story of the workers in the vineyard. Remember, some worked 1 hour, some worked 11 hours, some in between. But they all got the same. They all got the same pay, right? 1 denarius, which was the usual pay for a day's wage. Now, one of the first things you got to do with that, you got a conflict. Well, I'll tell you the conflict of that one. Conflict of that is, why would Jesus tell a story in which the hero is unjust? I want to tell you, it says that they grumbled. That's because they couldn't print what they said. But it's even meaner than this. It's even meaner than that. Do you notice they paid the last ones first? Which means, you imagine the excitement. When they sit around the circle and the bursar comes out, the financial steward comes out and pays the 5 o'clock folks, worked only 1 hour, and pays them 1 denarius. Can you imagine how thrilled you'd be if you'd worked since 7 in the morning? You say, this guy's paying 1 denarius per hour. All right, this is my day. Feels like the lottery to me. At any rate. Then they start paying the 3 o'clock people. And I imagine somebody say, no, sir. So they worked 3 hours, not 1. They deserve 3. Oh, they get the same amount. And then pretty soon after that, but by the time they get to the 7 o'clock folks, they are just a little perturbed. Not only is it grossly unfair to make them, this is a good case for the National Labor Relations Board, but they, not only that, but it's also pretty stupid. Because this guy's going to head to the marketplace tomorrow morning about 6:45 to pick up workers. Nobody there. He better come back around 4:45. There'll be quite a few workers looking for work. Anyway, well, we spent too much time on that. Anyway, the point is, it's important. It's important, whatever the text, to work it in such a way that you start with an issue, a conflict, and I never finished that though. What I have to say about that one, because I was talking about reversal and sudden shift, and that is, see, the issue is this, as I experience it. If this is a business deal, the story's wrong. It's bad. The wrong person's a hero. This is not a business deal. This is a covenant. The people who first heard the story knew it when it said the vineyard of the Lord. That means the chosen people. They knew what it meant. So if you can't find the answer in the text, you might try going behind the text. Because 1/2 chapter before is a story of the rich young ruler. Remember, who came, went sorrowfully away, and the disciples dropped their jaws because Jesus says, easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than a rich person to get in the... Oh, they said, God, that's impossible. Well, with people it's impossible. With God, all things are possible. And then you remember what Simon Peter did? He waltzed up to Jesus with one foot in his mouth, and he said, but Master, we've left everything to follow you. What do we get? You know the answer? It's in that parable. Cheated. If you're in a calculating mood, say, well, I've given it all. What do I get for my reward? Hey, it looks like you went to work at 7. You're going to get cheated. See, the kingdom is not a business deal. It's a covenant in which God invites us into the vineyard. And so whether we've been invited at 7:15 or 5:15, praise God, we've been invited. See, there's the difference. All right. Anyway, enough. Okay, now I've left myself with almost no time to do what I'd planned to do for the whole time. At any rate, so we better move on. And therefore, anyway, I got to get rid of this. And then get another set of them. End the show. Yes, we're going to end the show. All right. Now, if I can get this up. Aha. Just what I was looking for. What we need to talk about is varieties. That is to say, this is the time when I want to stretch my plot. That is to say, I've always used the term narrative preaching up until the last couple of 3 years. And in my last book, the sermon, Dancing the Edge of Mystery, I've tried to give, what I've realized is that there are other forms of the new hermeneutic, as Esslinger calls it. There are other forms of the new hermeneutic that do not follow exactly my plot line. And they need to be considered because they have more in common than they do not in common. But unfortunately, some people think they're all the same. And therefore, they don't quite understand the breadth. It's sort of like expository preaching. Is all expository preaching the same? No. Depends on who's the expositor. And it depends on what the occasion is. How you do your exegesis in the text, how you do the congregational exegesis, how you do the world historical exegesis will determine. So there's lots of varieties in whatever sermonic, at any rate. So I've always said that a narrative sermon is any sermon in which the shape of the sequence, the shape is in the form of a plot with a strategic delay of the preacher's meaning. The strategic delay is the critical issue. Not only make them laugh, make them cry, but by all means make them wait. So there's more than one kind of plotted sermon. I really call, in a sense, I could just call them all narrative, but I think at this point I'm going to take the word narrative and tighten them up and give some other possibilities. So, other varieties, and I keep changing this list all the time. One is what we talked about this morning, Fred Kradic's inductive preaching, which means so similar to my narrative that no wonder it was Fred who wrote the foreword to the expanded edition of Homiletical Plot, to say what had happened in 20 years. Because inductive means you start with the particular. What I have added, or what I've tried to say, in addition to his notion of starting with the particular, say it's not just any old particular, it's problematic particulars. It is issue particulars. You're preaching on the woman taken in adultery. And so you know, Jesus is teaching in front of the house of prayer. And I'm probably telling a parable when these scribes and Pharisees show up pushing this woman, push him into his presence, saying, now the law of Moses says what we should do to this woman. What do you say, to test him? And he leaned down and wrote in the sand. Doesn't say what he wrote. I asked a class one time, what do you think he wrote in the sand? Somebody said, I bet he asked, where's the man? Think about it. And it's strange, they were caught in the act of adultery. It was not a rumor. Caught in the act. Somehow the good old boy got away. Isn't that interesting? Yeah, the bad woman. Oh, we got the bad woman. She's still in custody. But the good old boy is still roaming around. But now, you know, in that story, you start with a particular, but you got to start with the particulars that have an issue. By the way, I don't know that he wrote anything. What I think is when Jesus was leaning down, perhaps he was worried they would start throwing stones, and he was trying to duck a little. Well, that's just my imagination. But at any rate, the thing I notice is that the thing is decisively turned by the discovery of who these men are and what their motive is. Generally, what we do in biblical work that is so fatal for the imagination and for the spirit is we take the bad people and make them the villains. And sometimes that's true, but you better make a good case for them before you turn it on them. I mean, when I've asked people, why were the men in the circle with their stones ready to, stone the woman to death? They said, well, they wanted to test Jesus. They were evil like that. And I've had people say, well, because they had been in bed with a woman and they just didn't want her to tell. That won't work. Give me a couple of good reasons why you ought to be there with a stone to follow the law of Moses. Give me good, decent reason. What? It's what God said to do. It's clear in the Deuteronomic law. And if they don't, then what happens? The community, I mean, do you believe in family values or not? I mean, you're just going to let this go by? I mean, and the real, what you've got to do is get the men with the stones. And remember, it said Jesus said, let the one without sin cast the first stone. This is an incredible moment. Jesus was not the one to bring the good news. It was the eldest male in the circle. Remember, all eyes turned to the eldest male, the scribes and Pharisees, because they respected age. It doesn't happen in this culture, let me tell you. But anyway, we won't go there. Anyway, they respected age. So when Jesus said, let the one without sin cast the first stone, all eyes turned to the eldest male. And what did he do? He turned his hand over, dropped. Now you know. Well, you notice, and then they turned to the next oldest. They could not bring themselves to be law-abiding according to the Scripture because of the challenge that Jesus had given them. They could not bring themselves. And so remember, notice that they came together. You notice the text said they went away one by one. Not only did they go in isolation and in separation, they also went without jobs. Is anybody going to trust a scribe who scribed what you're supposed to do to an adulterous person? Who in a public place failed to do it? Anybody going to look up to a Pharisee as a model person of the community when the person failed this morning to do what Moses' law describes? Well, I mean, Jesus said, neither do I. Where are your accusers? Neither do I. Notice he didn't say, I'll make a little deal with you. You promise me you'll never do something like this and I'll let you go. Is that what he said? No. He turned it around. He said, neither do I condemn you. Go. It's interesting which order he did it in. Well, anyway, enough of that. That's inductive. You move, but not just any particulars that provide an issue, a torque, a tension. What you're looking for the juxtaposition, as Paul Scott Wilson of Toronto says, in his first book, The Imagination of the Heart, he said, he said, I remember physics class in high school, and if you A teacher would have somebody crank an old telephone. I know you don't know that old telephones have cranks, but I've seen pictures of them. And somebody's cranking the generator, and the teacher holds the wires out here at each pole, and nothing happens. You can put the poles together. Something does happen, but nobody sees anything. Nobody hears anything. The juice is going through all right. Nothing to notice. You pull it. Paul Scott Wilson remembers. Pull 6 inches apart, and every so often there's a zap that happens between the 2 poles. If you hold them at 4 inches, there's a constant arc that will be created. You can see it, you can hear it. Now that's what Paul Scott Wilson means about the juxtaposition. That's what we're looking for in the particulars. We're looking for the kind of particulars that have something sideways, torque. I want to hear a zap. I want to hear something that is problematic. Now, another one is called story. Now, a lot of people think narrative and story. In fact, I'm just going to go ahead and go to narrative to put them together. Most people think that story preaching and narrative preaching is one and the same, and it's not. Let me give you from a different vantage point. If I use the term medicine, what do I mean? Tell me what I meant by what's the referent for the term medicine? I heard somebody say prescription. Did I hear prescription? Prescription. And is that the way you thought of medicine? What's another one? Doctor? Yes. The practice of medicine. Now, is medicine and medicine the same? No. You could say one medicine is a part of another medicine. That is, within the practice of medicine, a doctor may prescribe a medicine. You hear it? But they're not. One is a subset of the other. Medicine, as in drug, might be a part of a physician's practice of medicine. Story may be one kind of narrative sermon. In short, as Kradic says, a narrative sermon may be one long story, in which case it is a story narrative sermon. But it's not likely, he said. It may have a narrative sermon may have chock full of stories, but it may not. It's not likely. A narrative sermon may not have a story at all. What a story is? A story has characters, setting, plot, tone. Do you know what my meaning of the tone is? It sounds like a pale term. It means the veto power of the one doing the telling. You know what I mean? You give the same text to Billy Graham and Marjorie Suhaki and have them both preach on it. Let me tell you, you're going to get different sermons. Because it's different. The tone is different. What some people see in a text and what others see in a text, and they may not be either or good and bad. They may just be different. But the point is tone, and then there's a plot. There's movement. That's always a story sermon. Now, sometimes narrative sermon has to do not with a story at all. Remember the notion of temporal sequence. I'm looking for temporal sequence. Music has a temporal sequence. I can, as I think I said the other hour, Bishop Gerald Kennedy could take a parable, which is a story, and turn it into a 3-point sermon, which is not narrative. I can take a passage out of Paul, which is not narrative, and turn it into a temporal sequence sermon. Or if I preach the prodigal son, it may be a narrative sermon. Do you hear it? The text is narrative. The way I shape the sermon, it may be narrative. All right. Well, we got to move on. At any rate, one of the reasons I don't deal with story too much is that most of us are not equipped to do it well. I tried once doing a contemporary parable. I was preaching at a church every Holy Week in Iowa. And every year I'd get this invitation, say, we'd love to have you, looking forward to have you come back to preach our Holy Week services. Well, one time I decided to invent a parable. It was a true story. It was a story of my father. I called it the toolbox. It was a powerful, powerful story, powerful parable that I created. I thought. But the next year when I got the letter inviting me to return once more to preach Holy Week, the pastor said, we always enjoy your biblical narrative sermons. And I knew exactly. I did not have to have that spelled out. And no more. And there are some people who can create modern day parables. If you do follow the work of Charles Rice, from Drew or Jensen, the Lutheran, there are people who can do those. I try to create a model for homiletics that us ordinary people can do. And I don't have that kind of special skill. At any rate, although I can preach a parable, but in that sense, I take a story and turn it into a narrative sermon. Anyway, so we got to move on. Now, sometimes I've experienced, particularly the last 20 years, particularly as we began to have more and more women coming through St. Paul's School of Theology, and then Gen X students, and then millennialists as well. Episodal preachers. Actually, even Fred Kradic is an episodal preacher, not just an inductive preacher. Now, here's what I mean by episodal. I call it loose narrative. Here's the way sometimes a sermon will go. Somebody tells maybe a story, a vignette, or paints a picture, and tells a story. Doesn't say why they're doing it, just does it, and all of a sudden moves to a second component. Makes no transitions. Let me tell you, I want them to follow my loop, but they don't. They just shift and all. I mean, Fred Kradic is a good illustration. Fred Kradic will have you in the middle of a text, the Bible story or a Bible text that he's just read, and he'll have us, and all of a sudden we're in aisle 11 in a supermarket in our town. You say, how'd he get there? Well, you don't know. But you're there, and because of his wit and wisdom, you can't help but be there. Let me tell you, Fred Kradic never has a single ordinary experience. because the sensory apparatus is out. When he walks through aisle 11, he sees stuff that's in my hometown, aisle 11, that I never noticed for 20 years. But when I get back, I see it because he helped me to see it. Do you understand what I'm talking about? Some people, us ordinary folks, I mean, it's really marvelous to experience it. Anyway, all of a sudden, while, just still walking the aisle and turning the cart around from aisle 11, all of a sudden, Fred Kradic is in a new text. So, how did he get there? Doesn't matter, we're there. And often, episodal preaching is such that only when you get to the final episode or the final piece of the sermon will you understand what all the rest of them meant. An easier illustration is my colleague Tex Sample. Do some of you know my colleague Dr. Tex Sample who does stuff on sociology of religion and ethics and worship, the spectacle of worship in a wired world is his latest book. Tex, he tells one story in a sermon. Then the middle part is not a story. And then he turns to he got three of them, no transitions anywhere. And when he told the first story, he said, oh, yeah, that's good. And then when you look in his eye and say, I think he meant more than I understood. You look around to see if you're dumb and somebody else knows. Did you get that? And pretty soon Tex is in some more or less left brain. He's treating the subject, wrestling with it. And pretty soon, here's another story. It's this final one. And you say, well, listen, what did he tell all that about? It didn't fit the first story. And you get the third item, which is another story. And when he gets a punchline, all of a sudden, it's like an embrace that goes by and hugs the rest of what had been said. And you understand for the first time what it meant. The best though, and I don't have time to give the illustration. I've got it with me, but I don't have time. But Tom Troger. Tom Troger. Okay. The only thing that's bad about this is that this isn't the usual sermon. This is a wedding sermon. And I'm going to do this as fast as I know how to do it because it's really important. He's in his book, Imagining a Sermon. He's giving a sample rhetorical sermon for the print generation. He meant my age. I'm print people, you understand? And he says, I turn on my word process and decide that since I only have a few minutes to create the homily, I'll step directly into the theme. And so he starts I can't type anything. It's not a sermon, it's a dissertation. But he does. In a few moments, Catherine and Jonathan will repeat the vows. I promise in covenant before God and these witnesses to be your faithful and loving wife, husband, for better, for worse, for richer, for poor. You've been there. Then it says, promise and covenant. What antique words these are, not something we know in Romanesque letters on a stone monument or something. Promise and covenant, they're not words of everyday speech, not 7-Eleven stuff. They're words, we don't use these words for coffee break. Promise and covenant, these are sacred words. When a couple speaks them in a wedding service, they set loose again the voices of Abraham, Sarah, Moses, the prophets, the apostles. He moves to the Bible. Promise and covenant, these are words that are deeper than feeling. It's hard for us to grasp the idea. In our society, there's a tendency to reduce everything to what an individual feels. But feelings alone are inadequate foundation for marriage. If I love you today, if I feel I love you today, I may feel different tomorrow. Promise and covenant, well, he does that a couple more times. Remember when your bodies fall from illness or age. Remember when you spoke harsh words to each other. And you remember, hear again the voice of one who loves you with an everlasting love. It's not a bad sermon here. Promise and covenant, you got it. But he says, I stop and read the sermon, and he says, I'm not pleased. I'm not pleased. Because it sounds too talky for the generation of television viewers who will be present for this wedding. So he says, going to do something else. So he does, if I can find it. Well, it's here. A sample visual sermon for the mass media generation. Okay? Here's the way the sermon goes. I'm going to get through it as quickly as I can. I once met a couple who told me that every anniversary they donned their wedding clothes and had their picture taken in the living room of their house. They plan to do it throughout their life and then collect them in an album. As you, Catherine and Jonathan, stand before the congregation in your wedding clothes, I'm remembering that other couple in their 5th anniversary coming down to the living room for their annual picture. She's in the white gown. He's wearing his 3-piece suit, formal tie. They're waiting for the next door neighbor who's gone to get some extra flash cubes. Did you hear the historical reference? Flash cubes. The couple won't forget that. The first 4 years, they hired a professional photographer, but this has not been a good year for them financially. Husband lost the job. Wife's only able to get part-time employment. Second child having medical problems. Finally, neighbor arrives, positions them in the front of the fireplace, suggests they hold hands the way they did when they said their vows, the way you, Catherine and Jonathan, are about to do, while their friend fidgets with the focus. Tom Troger also is a hymn writer. Looking at lots of hymns, you'll find Tom Troger. He fidgets with the focus. Isn't that good? Yeah, he figures. He fidgets with the focus. The wife notices stuffings coming out of the sofa and wishes they had some money to redo it. The husband sees the daughter's broken doll, thinks of the one he saw in the shop window, can't afford. Flash. Picture number 1, said their friend. He steps back for another angle. The wife says, do you remember the vows? We memorize them. Think for a moment. They repeat together. I promise and covenant before God and these witnesses to be their faithful for better, for us. You know it. Poorer stops. The words burst like a flash cube on their friend's camera. It highlights the stack of bills on the table beneath the phone and the calendar marked with the doctor's appointments they cannot afford. A look leaps. We promised. The camera flashes again. That'll be a good one. Now I picture the couple of 10 years later. Things are much better for them financially. Husband has a good job. Wife went back to school. Is just taken an excellent position. The love seats by the fireplace have been recovered. Each of the children have 10-speed bikes in the garage, but the husband and wife have thrown acid words at one another. The second child, after all the trips to the doctor, is in trouble. Each partner has said to the other, if you were not so preoccupied with your job and could give some time to the family, things would be different. On their 15th anniversary, they've come home and say they're too tired to get in the wedding clothes. Then they remember the photographer is coming in 20 minutes, has probably already left her studio. We'll charge them for the visit no matter. So they trek up to the attic, throw themselves into the musty clothes. They got to suck it in to get the zippers shut. The doorbell rings, the photographer comes in. Come on now, hold hands, smile for the camera. While the photographer clicks away, they get lost in the moment, begin to repeat, I do promise and covenant before God, and these for this, for better, for worse. Worse, flashes as brightly as Poor did 10 years before, and the look leaps, we promised. Finally, I picture them at the 47th anniversary. They don't know whether they're going to make it to the 50th. He's had 2 heart attacks. Her hands are crooked with arthritis. The granddaughter herself engages upstairs, breaking down the clothes. The dress is yellowed. When the wife puts it on, she tears the seam. The husband can't get the trousers zippered. But if the picture's from the waist up, just gets it, that'll be all right. He takes the wife's hands, her knuckles swollen and knobby, and out of the faltering bodies arises a whisper of the sacred, I do covenant before God and these witnesses to be your faithful and loving wife, husband, for better, for worse, until death us do us part. In sickness and to death, Words that had slipped easily out of their mouths on their wedding day, now heavy with meaning. I got to go upstairs for more film, says her granddaughter, but they're not listening. They're looking into each other's eyes. They see something more beautiful than the prized pictures in the album. The grace and the glory of a promise kept. That's our prayer for you, Catherine and Jonathan, that for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to death do you part. You may know the grace and glory of a promise kept. May God, who's made an everlasting covenant with us, grant you the strength to keep your covenant for a lifetime. You know, I've read that so many times, I don't know why I get caught up in it, except it's so powerful. Well, you sense what expository is? Instead of organizing material by its logic, I mean, you could do it, you could organize it narratively, even if it's not a story. I mean, Hegelian logic is narrative in shape, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Is that not narrative? And then the synthesis becomes the next thesis. Well, but in this case, Tom Troger realized that he could not do something for my generation. So he used the occasion of taking a picture as a way to a vignette for one part of the covenant. One part again, one part again. And the result is that the gospel gets preached. But it's episodal. What is the continuity? When one says, there ain't no continuity. There are lapses of 5 and 10 and 20 more years. Oh, the camera. The moment is the continuity that holds the sermon together. And it moves to a dramatic finish. Well, oh gosh. Oh, no, not 3 more. No. Well, we're going to do the African American transconscious. Now, there are lots of different traditions in the African American experience. A lot in common, but there are a lot of differences. If you've heard Peter Gomes, anybody here heard Peter Gomes, who's chaplain at Harvard? If you've heard Peter Gomes, you'll never hear a whoop. Do you know what I mean by a whoop? You'll never hear that closing celebration that Henry Mitchell talks about. Now, if you hear Zan Holmes from Dallas, you're going to get the whoop. You're going to get. What's strange is you're not going to get an inductive sermon like Fred is talking about. It may be deductive. In some strands of the African American pulpit experience, you begin by announcing the theme and indicating the text and saying what you're going to accomplish. You say, well, that sure let the cat out of the bag, didn't it? Oh, not if it's an African American tradition, it isn't. And that's why Gardner Taylor, of Concord Baptist Church, of New York City, he could say, you start low, you go slow, you get high, you strike fire, you retire. Well, you can't do that with European American preachers, because we may start low and then get lower and longer, and we never have a whoop at the end. We just finally end it. Well, actually, the people generally have ended it first. Anyway, that's a caricature, of course. You know that. I'm kidding, partly. Partly I'm kidding. What I mean by that, there's a tension. There's a tension, as Henry Mitchell talks about African American preaching. And that is, there's a tension growing. Even as you're going slow, people in the congregation may yell forward and say, take your time. Take your time. Because everybody knows it's going to be going somewhere. Take your time and tell it all. And if you're not doing well, somebody may say, step on up, brother. Or things get worse. If things get worse, they may say, help him, Jesus. or finally, bring it on home. That means, hey, buddy, the sermon's been over for some time. You just will stop talking. But at any rate, in that tradition that Zan Holmes represents, we're not going to try that out today. We're going to leave it. Anyway, the point is, then after the content has been firmly established, the preacher picks up. The preacher picks up one piece of that, probably the good news, not the indicative of it, not the imperative of its claim. And it's interesting. Do you notice that when the preacher begins to pull out, very quietly the organist moves back to the Hammond? Yeah. Moves back to the Hammond, and the preacher begins to say something, and the organist comes with a chord, and then another chord, and it builds, and it grows, and the whoop is happening, and by the time it's through, it's an utter, what Henry Mitchell says, it's an utter celebration. And you say, well, but it wasn't narrative the way Lowry talks about. No, not technically, except that underneath the material was this growing suspense. Everybody knows that in terms of some forms of black preaching funerals. You don't just say, we live in the hope of the resurrection of God. Thank you very much, and blessed be the Father. Until you get Aunt Sarah, personally, by name, inside the pearly gates, that sermon better not finish. You got to get, and we see Peter there at the gate, and we find, and it's announced that she now is home in heaven. Oh, in the Catholic tradition, they call it Mass for the dead. Very important for us Protestants to learn that, particularly those of us who are European Americans. At any rate, that's the African. And Henry Mitchell talks about transconsciousness. Here's what he means. He says, in this oppressed community, there are certain things that are known implicitly. They're known so well that it's like a tip of an iceberg. That you see it here and you know it here, but there's so when the preacher, the role of the preacher is to tap the transconscious. Now, he doesn't mean Freudian unconscious. I would call it the preconscious. In other words, have you ever met somebody that you've just barely met and they say something and you know right away that they're one of your kind of people? They say, you can trust them. You know that they know. So when the black preacher gets up and reads the text, say, I was a stranger in a strange land. You don't have to explain that to the congregation. Or when it's that, can you praise, the songs designed in a foreign land? Well, I mean, the roof trembles. Now, what I want to say in behalf of that notion of transconsciousness is that it isn't just African Americans, it's European Americans and other kinds of people in the world too, who also have stuff that's right underneath the surface. That is, note this, it's not just personal knowledge, it's corporately stored knowledge that's implicit and available to individuals. And that's what links community together. If you've ever been in the oppressed, well, I remember when I went to school at Drew and I served a church, Methodist church in West New York, New Jersey, 85% Roman Catholic, the rest are Lutherans, and then some RCA Reformed, and some Jewish people, and pretty soon you get down to Methodist. I didn't know what it meant to be a Methodist in Kansas, where there are more Methodists than people. We were everybody. How would you know who you are? But then I got to West New York, and I asked somebody, when I first arrived, where's the Methodist church? They said, what? You see, I had to find it. And it's interesting how much more John Wesley meant to me there than he ever had before. How much being a Methodist meant to me there as it didn't in Kansas. If you've not been minority, you just don't understand what transconsciousness may mean. Because when you're at the edge, or when you're the few, it's very easy to be able to understand what Henry Mitchell talks about it in terms of transconsciousness. Now, we can't. All right. How many of you, do you know the name David Buttrick? Some do, a few do. David Buttrick has this phenomenological move. That's a kind of a heady title for it. I call it move sermon. What he does is it's sort of like episodal preaching, except it's more formal and a lot more rules. He wrote this big fat book called Homiletic. And if you tire of having something nice to read for good night reading, you can always put this by the bed, and it'll outlive you because you'll never get through it. But at any rate, he says the role of a sermon is to structure the consciousness of the congregation. And you do that by doing moves, little episodes, 5 or 6 of them. And I say, David, what you call a move is really the stop. The move is what happens in between. I always say, if you can imagine David Buttrick's move, in which the point is to establish the consciousness of the theological, biblical reality. If you can imagine a sermon as a string of pearls, David Buttrick will focus in on the pearls. I focus in on the string that attaches the pearls. But at any rate, so if you're interested in a tightly structured episodal, the other episodal was kind of loosely structured. But with David Buttrick, he's talking about moving until you arrive at the end of the line. And he asked the question. Remember, we started with Buttrick this morning. He says the question you ask of a text is, what does it intend you to do? Not just what did it say, but what does the text want to do now in this place and time? And anyway, we finally. There are those, Lucy Rose is one of them, John McClure is another, they're both Presbyterians. Conversational or collaborative preaching, what they really mean is some way, one of the problems with preaching is that it appears that we've got a problem of hierarchy that is oppressive. We need to recognize it even if we don't quite acknowledge it. We need to find a way to deal with it. And I think narrative preaching is one way to deal with it. But one of the troubles with our preaching is that we already know the truth. That's why we're standing behind the pulpit. And they're obviously dumb. That's the reason they're out there. And so our role is to get them smart, like we are. Have you ever had anybody preach and thought that's what they were thinking of you? Actually, they're enlightening your sick soul. Well, so there are people who are saying we got to find a way to get preaching not to be a one-down enterprise in which I got the truth, let me tell it to you. Whether I'm sharing divine truths as traditional preachers do or divine self-revelation as the charismatic type of preachers will do, whatever I do, the question is, how can I do it? How can I do it in a way that does not seem to be a one-down relationship? If I'm supposed to be anointed, is the congregation not? That's a kind of an assumption to think that I'm anointed and they aren't. So anyway, Lucy Rose has tried to establish what she says a wager, an offering, in which she says you bring to the round table church. You bring a wager, an offering, and you don't ask for commitment. What you ask for is consideration. Now, I don't happen to go for it. But it is done in a plot. She follows my plot as a method of doing it. But what she's really saying is, we got to give up trying to change up somebody else because we want them changed. Now, the way John McClure deals with the same hierarchical issue is that he has a group prepare the sermon, and the preacher preaches it. And then the group meets after next Sunday. And the first question that the group asks is, how well did the preacher preach what we said to preach? That's another way to try to get away from the one-down situation. Well, I'm not altogether thrilled with either one of those because I'm afraid with... I asked Lucy Rose one time, I said, have you ever made an offering of something you didn't think important? I mean, just to name it is to say it's important. That's implicit authority. And to John McClure, I say, generally a horse designed by a committee turns out to be a camel. So, at any rate, well... this has been too long, but we got to stop. Here's my question. Can ordinary people learn how to prepare a narrative sermon? Is it possible that I've been doing narrative stuff without knowing it? For example, here's a sermon outline. Somebody gave me one place I was recently on the prodigal son. Roman numeral 1, his sadness. Roman numeral 2, his madness. Roman numeral 2, his gladness. Under 1 is his sadness. He traveled, he unraveled, he cavilled. His madness, 3 of them. He lost his togs, ate with the hogs, went to the dogs. And his gladness, he got the seal, he ate the meal, he danced the reel. Now, you say, that's a traditional deductive sermon, right? Except for this. Notice he didn't start with his gladness. He started with the time when he left. It may be that some of you, in doing 3-point sermons, technically, a 3-point sermon, you ought to be able to interchange 1, 2, and 3. Right? They're all equidistant from the theme sentence, right? Except if you do his sadness first, and then his madness, and then his gladness, you're following something that's narrative in shape, even though you have 3 points. Well, the point I'm making right now is there are some of you here who are already into precisely what I'm here to talk about. And maybe what needs to happen is to be given permission. Sometimes, but whether you've never experienced it, or you experience it and you don't know you've been experiencing it and you need it named, or whether it's utterly new, here's what I believe about it. Narrative preaching is actually more efficient in its preparation and more effective in its presentation. That's my claim. And that ordinary people can do it. You see, because you remember when you were children, you knew narrativity, didn't you? You were playing with a friend, you're playing cops and robbers, right? Do you remember cops and robbers? Nobody else. Did you play cops? Okay. All right. Now, what happened after in the story with your friends or friend? Did the cop found the robber and put him in jail? Story over. What did you do? You had more time to play. What did you do? What? The robber escaped. Precisely. Do you see how narrative we were as children? Well, yes, and slashes the tires of the squad car. That way, you see, you're going to get precisely because you got to just not make them laugh and make them cry. You got to make them wait. So you slash the tires, or you're all by yourself and you don't have anybody to play with, and so you decide you're going to play. You're going to play Life in the Jungle. Oh, you know what? Tell me some of the animals you had in the jungle in your backyard. Please tell me. What? Lion. Huh? Bear. Something in the back. Monkey. What else? Now I want to notice. Nobody said Cocker Spaniel. You said, well, you were talking the jungle, but I want you to notice. Typically, when we put things in our backyard, we put those that have risk. The bear can kill you. Even a monkey can kill you. Do you notice? You knew as a child how to do that. You didn't have to be told in seminary. You knew as a child. Nobody said snake, but my backyard jungle always had a snake. Boa constrictor. And you had to escape. Well, in short, what I'm saying is we know a whole lot about narrative preaching, even if we've never done it. We knew as children. So my question is, that's my allegation at least. So the question is, can ordinary folks like us do it? How would you go about preparing a narrative sermon? Well, guess we'll have to find out later in the day. Thank you. All right. Before we go, let us pray. Oh God, we give you thanks for Jesus, the great storyteller and the Redeemer. We give you thanks for the Bible that leads us into tomorrow. And we give you thanks for your graciousness that allows us to be a part of your tomorrow. So dismiss us with your blessing. Bring us back hopeful in order to bring your word to a needy world. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.